Hello, I'm Barbara Dawson and I'm director of the Hugh Lane Gallery. And I'm here to talk about an extraordinary artwork, Francis Bacon's Studio, which has been in the gallery open to the public since 2001, having been donated to us in 1998 by the artist heir, John Edwards, supported by Brian Clark, who is the executor of the estate. Francis Bacon died in 1992. And though he was renowned internationally, he wasn't then the famous artist and figure he is today. And although his paintings sold for considerable amounts of money, they weren't fetching the stratospheric amounts of money they do fetch today. And when we started this studio project, we did receive much criticism at the time, preserving a heap of detritus. What was the point? The artist was now dead. Who is pulling the wool over whose eyes? And however, Francis Bacon's studio project, an eventual resting place for the studio, has now received considerable acclaim in the gallery. It has been described by Ambrose Clancy of the Washington Post as one of the most stunning events in European art circles in years. It has become a famous art attraction in Ireland, with people visiting Dublin solely to see the studio. But what is it and how did this come about? In 1997, I first visited Francis Bacon's studio, 7 Rees Mews, South Kensington, London, with Brian Clark and John Edwards. Climbing the steep wooden stairs which led from the street up to the first floor modest flat, I wasn't prepared for the visceral reaction I experienced entering that small, cramped space. It was like looking into the artist's head. It was a phenomenological experience, the tensity of the space, the smell of the turpentine and the paint, the mountains of material and books on such diverse subject matter as dance and cookery, bodybuilding, bullfighting, film, Egyptian art, hundreds of photographs creased and folded and trampled upon, pages torn from magazines, books on artists, leaves from catalogues with reproductions of his own paintings. It was a conglomeration of animal and human imagery, all dissected and plundered by Bacon as part of the process of creation. In a way, the studio was somewhat like a Bacon painting, an intense charged blitzkrieg of sensation. Francis Bacon moved into 7 Rees Mews in 1961 at a time when investigation into studio process and the relationship of the artist to the artwork, its production, eventual resting place and audience was rapidly evolving. The Function of the Studio by French conceptual artist Daniel Buren was published in 1971, and Buren investigates that relationship between the artwork, the place of fabrication, the studio, and the place of exhibition and widespread distribution, the gallery or museum. He rejects the studio as place of production for the portable artwork, arguing that such means of production gives rise to the compromise of the artwork due to the requirements for it to adapt to other destinations, be it gallery or museum space or indeed the collector's wall. Removing them from their place of production when they come into their being and their ability to adapt to multiple locations where they are prone to interpretation and manipulation of curatorial authorship renders them, in his opinion, soulless. In 1976, Brian O'Doherty published a series of essays in Art Forum, Inside the White Cube, discussing the critical relationship of context to content and exposing the myth of neutrality of the gallery space. However, Francis Bacon stands outside that argument. For him, the studio was an intimate environment, a private place of production, a locus genesis or incunabulum where the judgment is suspended in the process of art making. He had great attachment to place, and this small studio measuring 6 by 4 meters was the center of his life, where he lived and worked for over 30 years. Francis Bacon was somewhat a late starter, not taking up painting till he was in his late 20s, having previously been an interior designer, a bon vivant, very bon vivant, a gambler and high liver. He continued to be a gambler and high liver. He first achieved claim in 1945 for his triptych, 3 figures at the base of a crucifixion, which went on exhibition at the Lefebvre Gallery in London. This was after the war, and as has been noted, a spirit of optimism and hope prevailed. However, both the critics and the public were rocked and unsettled by this work. Described as a cross between Hieronymus Bosch and Picasso, the startling images were unnerving. The young artist Richard Hamilton recalls visiting the Lefebvre to see what was going on and recalling from the impact of these figures, saying, "What the hell are these?" And John Russell recounted how shocked he was by the images, so unrelievably awful that the mind shut with a snap at the sight of them. At this time, Francis Bacon had his studio at Severn Cromwell Place, coincidentally nearby the Irish artist John Lavery's former studio, which was number 5 Cromwell Place. But Bacon lived there during the war, and it was a destination place for not only painting, but gambling, drinking, and parties, as I said, which he would continue to do throughout his life. He gave up Cromwell Place in 1951, and for some years moved from place to place, ending up in Battersea in 1955. This image is of Bacon in his Overstrand Mansions Battersea studio. It's taken by Cecil Beaton in 1960 and shows a relaxed Bacon enjoying the scrutiny of the camera lens, apparently very welcoming to the photographer. As we subsequently learned, because of taking out the studio and archive, that Bacon would accumulate photographs of himself in his studio, which would become reference points for his paintings and sometimes directly for his self-portraits. Cecil Beaton sacked Bacon in 1957, took 2 years to complete the portrait, but he was shocked and disappointed at the final result, describing the hands clasped as emerald scratches, which looked like claws. So Bacon took the criticism well and ultimately destroyed the painting. A year later, he moved into Rhys Mews, and despite his growing wealth and fame over the next 3 decades, he lived and worked there until his death in 1992. As I surveyed the scene in 1997, all those years ago, it was 5 years after the artist had died, and the accumulated chaos, though it was a strange sort of laboratory, it was where Bacon's chemistry came alive, and he created those charged, visceral images. He uses this imagery as a prompt in the act of painting, manipulating and pushing the paint into a certain autonomy, which creates independent images of great force and impact. In his interviews with David Sylvester, Bacon frequently speaks about images, and indeed one time spoke of images dropping into his head like a sequence of frames in a film. And now I understand what he meant. Filtering through that crazy juxtapositioning of imagery, compost heaps, as Peter Beard called them, they served as an ignition for his imagination. But was it worth keeping this now that the paintings had come into being and were independent of the place of production? What more could this yield up? Looking at the books on art and artists of the past, including Egyptian art, Velázquez and Rembrandt, I was reminded of how ambitious Bacon was and pitted himself against the great artists of previous generations, and the result of which, of course, he created some of the most powerful and original images of the human form in the history of European painting. As I surveyed the chaos of the material of the studio with material in heaps on the floor, crammed onto shelves and stuffed into cardboard boxes, my eye was caught by some familiar faces. A photograph of the Swiss sculptor Giacometti, whom Bacon greatly admired. The artist and muse Isabel Rawsthorne, who Bacon greatly admired, and who introduced Bacon to Giacometti. The handsome petty criminal George Dyer, Bacon's lovers in the 60s, and the subjects of some of Bacon's great paintings, seen here with Francis at Isabel Rawsthorne's exhibition opening at the Marlborough Gallery in London in 1968. And a photograph of Peter Beard, the renowned American wildlife photographer and friend of Bacon's, who sadly died last month. The move to Rhys Mews coincided with the shift in Bacon's career as a painter. The 50s saw his extraordinary series of heads, also known as Pope series, Men in Blue series, among other works, where unidentified subjects in an isolated and distressed state, hermetic, sometimes incarcerated environments. Towards the end of the 50s, he moved to portraiture and painted his first self-portrait in 1963. However, he abandoned the life model apart from himself, no doubt influenced by the experiences of sitters such as Cecil Beaton, and instead drew on photographs and the printed image as a point of departure from his subjects, commissioning several photographers such as famous Vogue photographer John Deacon to take photographs of people for him. He chose his bohemian circle of friends who, like him, frequented the bars and clubs of Soho as subject matter, including Isabel Rostron and Henrietta Moraes, his lover George Dyer, and Muriel Belcher, the formidable and renowned proprietor of the famous private drinking club, the Colony Room, and also other people such as Peter Beard. Primarily, as I said, for these early 60s photographs, a lot of them were taken by the Vogue fashion photographer and drinking buddy, John Deacon. And these photographs, even from the early 60s, remained in Bacon's studio in their dilapidated states, growing old alongside their protagonist. Bacon's strong association with his studio is underpinned by a series of photographs of Rhys Muse taken by various photographers over the 3 decades he lived there. As I said, Bacon appeared to enjoy these sessions and appears in numerous different poses for the professional photographers. Jorge Lewinsky's photographs date from the mid-60s and include a brooding Bacon standing at the top of that famous wooden staircase. A portrait, he also takes the portrait of the artist with an image of his painting Seated Figure 1961 superimposed onto the picture. There are photographs by Michael Holtz with Bacon leaning against the coloured splattered walls of his studio, and Michael Pergolani also took a series of photographs of Bacon, as well as others, including Peter Beard and Jane Brown. Peter Stark's images, there was a lot found in the studio, 96 in all, and mostly black and white, became quite interesting as direct points of reference for some of Bacon's self-portraits. This photograph is outside the actual studio and in the muse itself, with the bizarre arrangement of kitchen cum bathroom. And Bacon had both a hand basin and a sink in the kitchen. And here we see him in a photograph by Peter Stark, leaning against the sink, looking against the hand basin, looking somewhat dejected as he poses for the photographer. This photograph is a direct source of reference for Bacon for his painting Study of Self-Portrait 1963. John Deacon's detailed photographs of George Dyer in Bacon's studio are the only photograph, a series of images of anybody in Bacon's studio apart from the artist himself. And Dyer was the subject, as I said, a model for many of paintings of Bacon's great paintings, including the great triptych May-June 1973, painted after Dyer's death in Paris in 1971 on the eve of Francis Bacon's retrospective in the Grand Palais. It is one of Bacon's supreme achievements, a monumental composition which engenders both intense pity and, indeed, sheer terror, and was part of our exhibition in the Hugh Lane Gallery, Francis Bacon in Dublin in 2000. The anarchy of his studio is in direct contrast to Bacon's controlled compositions, but it is the friction between the two that he enjoyed, the creation between the two that he enjoyed, and the creation of his paintings inspired and influenced by the myriad of material in his extensive image bank, scattered on the floors where he trod upon it, allowing it to become worn and frayed, aging, as I said, like the artist, their deterioration embedding their effects of time into the patina of the studio's character, really an extension of the artist himself. Bacon did buy other studios, such as 80 Narrow Street in London's East End, overlooking the Thames. And in 1972, Peter Beard took a series of arresting images of Bacon on the roof of Narrow Street studio, using slow exposure to create a distortion reminiscent of Bacon's own work. To what extent was an image of use to Bacon, and what did it prompt? On the verso of this particular photograph, we find Bacon's shorthand, dated 1978, 6 years after the photograph was taken, where he references Velázquez, Pope, and self-portraits. And of course, Velázquez's famous portrait of Innocent X in Doria Pamphili was of a huge influence on Bacon in the 50s, and indeed a recurring theme throughout his career. Such shorthand was found in books and in other items in the studio, revealing that long after the picture was taken, it continued to have use for the artist. Bacon abandoned Narrow Street. The light reflecting off the river was too distracting, apparently, and he preferred the hermetic nature of Rhys Mews, where, apart from the skylight, the room was impervious to the outside world. But how do you keep this world, this atmosphere? As I discussed this dilemma with Brian Clark and John Edwards, it was my view that the studio's significance and impact in future years would depend on how it was preserved. Unlike Brancusi, for example, Bacon had no intention of planning for its continued existence after he died. And it wasn't a country house or a beautiful garden like Monet's studio at Giverny. We discussed at length, and to my delight and horror, they offered the project to me for the Hugh Lane Gallery. Preserve Francis Bacon's studio. What an honour, but also what a challenge. And what a responsibility. As we approach the 21st century, would the preservation of an artist's studio be a compelling project for a modern art gallery or museum? Why would you preserve an artist's studio in the late 90s, since, as I said earlier, the concept of studio and art production had shifted considerably, with the studio being where the artist finds themselves perhaps at any one time, and in some cases the place of production consisted primarily of a laptop or computer. What would the transformative effect of the museum have on this place of production now that the protagonist had left? However, this studio was both provocative and astonishing. And at this stage, we could not and did not know what the archive on the floor would consist of. What would the accumulation of the items reveal? Would it be worthless and a waste of money? How could I guarantee its success? In short, I really couldn't. But the place of production for such an extraordinary and renowned artist must be worth taking a risk. And so a pioneering project in museum practice began, namely to remove and relocate the entire studio and contents. My strategy was quite simple and clear. To be successful, the entire studio must be relocated, lock, stock, and barrel, with the minimum curatorial authority or intervention. And as we sailed into the relative unknown, for example, how do you conserve the painted walls that are not mural paintings but thrown up on timber and plasterboard, beautiful and all as they were? How do you safely remove hundreds of torn and creased items and preserve them for posterity? I needed to find a team that would support the vision. And I was so fortunate with the wonderful team that did work with me on this project. I discussed it with Mary McGrath, conservator, and we garnered a team of conservators, archaeologists, and curators who eagerly took on the challenge. The team of archaeologists, led by Ed Donovan, came on site, admitting that they had never worked on a dig as young as this one. I also reminded them that they had to put the material back. So they made the set two and made elevation drawings. You can see here the west end of the studio where the oval mirror and shelves below have been mapped out and the items removed. The survey drawings were divided the studio into 3 layers with location, fields and numbers marked on each of the items and each of the 3 drawings. And as the items were removed, they were catalogued by the curators and entries meticulously entered in analog in logbooks. These served as the reference numbers for each of the 7,000 plus items retrieved and catalogued later and inputted onto a specially designed database. We had some surprises on the journey. In removing some of the blank canvases stacked against the wall, this unfinished painting, untitled circa 1966, which eventually acquired for the collection, was discovered, much to our delight. And this small portrait of what appears to be John Edwards was cut from a larger canvas and revealed Bacon's way of editing and destroying work that he no longer approved of. However, he kept this part of the painting, so obviously it had of some interest and use for him. The items were wrapped and prepared for travel. The table of discarded materials and paints seen here leant against the wall, and when removed, revealed a swirl of marvelous colors, as you can see here, rather like a huge bouquet of flowers or balloons with their strings hanging down. And so insistent was I in the strategy for removing everything with curatorial authority suspended, that Mary McGrath even swept up the dust as a consequence of this focus. Bacon's studio environment had a sense of timelessness, a place where he experienced a suspension from reality and freedom to immerse himself in his work. Its parameters are not physical. The studio is a state of imminent arrival, a no man's land, as I said, where judgment is suspended in the process of art making. How would we position the studio within the gallery structure? This was extremely important. So I identified the location on the ground floors behind the enfilade of galleries. It had to be differentiated from other artworks, and a sense of drama to prepare the visitor for the studio was designed. It was created first by entering into an AV room where a fascinating and often hilarious account filmed of an interview between Francis Bacon and Melvyn Bragg. And it is conducted in the studio, which has actually remained just as it was in that wonderful film. The combination of a digital and physical sort of heightened the excitement and the experience for the visitor. The studio complex was designed by David Chipperfield, and so we also have a micro gallery where you can access digitally some of the items from the studio. However, it was also my opinion that whilst the studio still was a place of production, it might be becoming an artwork, also the results, the content results that came from that production should also be experienced. And with the assistance of generous donors and the estate, we purchased an additional 6 works by Francis Bacon, which complete the story. The wealth of material recovered from Francis Bacon's studio exceeded our expectations. It has yielded fascinating discoveries of Francis Bacon's thinking and mode of production. The archive and studio has been the basis of much new scholarship, conferences and symposia, and several scholarly publications and papers on new subjects, including Bacon's books, which Dr. Yvonne Scott from Trinity College and I organised, bringing forth many intriguing topics such as bacon and food. The studio opened to the public in 2001. The art gallery's transformation of the studio, I suppose, is no less potent than it is on an artwork. And so in some ways, the studio has become an artwork, and supported by the collection of Francis Bacon's paintings installed nearby, process and production interchange in a kind of continuous motion. However, that transformation depends on the spectator's perception and response. Otherwise, it becomes rendered lifeless. Francis Bacon said, "I would like my pictures to look as if a human being had passed between them, like a snail, leaving a trail of human presence and memory trace of past events, as a snail leaves its slime." His studio and archive is a monumental and fascinating trail of life and work of this great artist. But you know, even as the veils are parted and more of his working methods come to light, the studio still remains a visceral fascination and a mystery for those involved in its relocation. And as he recedes into history, I am reminded of his oft-quoted saying, paraphrasing Nietzsche, "Life is meaningless, so we might as well be extraordinary." Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that talk.